Barnett Rubin joins us now from New York. He's a leading researcher on Afghanistan and South Asia. He's also the director of the Center on International Cooperation at New York University. Previously, Barnett was a senior advisor to the U.S. Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. He's also been a policy advisor to the United Nations, NATO, the U.S. and Afghanistan. So who better to speak to than Barnett Rubin? Barnett, thank you so much indeed for your time. These documents are stunning. They show a concerted policy of covering up the truth about the war in Afghanistan. Who's going to be the most surprised? Because after all, most of us already believe that politicians lie regularly.
I frankly don't see why anyone would be surprised. But if I may, what I observe being in the government is something that is mentioned in this report, but perhaps inadequately, which is not only that the government deceived the public, but frankly, a lot of that was sincere. The officials of the U.S. government deceived themselves. I saw from very early on that our strategy was not working. It was based on unrealistic goals, not lack of understanding of the situation in Afghanistan and so on. But I encountered a lot of resistance from top officials who insisted that what we were doing was succeeding and that I was misinterpreting the facts.
So in other words, you believe, I think you might be saying that actually the war was driven by ideology rather than practicalities.
Well, it was driven above all by political considerations, not in a cynical way, but first of all, of course, there was a tremendous emotional reaction in the United States to the attack on us, and we just had to do something. Unfortunately, that led not only to the misconceived war in Afghanistan, but also to the totally illegitimate war in Iraq. But also, there was just a mismatch between what the United States government is capable of doing and what can possibly work in a society as impoverished, with as weak a state and as long a history of conflict as Afghanistan.
The papers, of course, that have been obtained by the Washington Post cover hundreds and hundreds of interviews with experts, diplomats, military personnel, etc. We've picked out some of the quotes that appear in this paperwork, and some are just quite amazing. And I'm just wondering how much of the lying came because senior officials just didn't understand what the strategy was, to the basic level of not knowing who the enemy was. Here's one quote. They thought I was going to come to them. In other words, someone talking about meeting senior officials. They thought I was going to come to them with a map to show them where the good guys and bad guys live. Another person saying it took several conversations for them to understand that I did not have that information in my hands. At first, they just kept asking, but who are the bad guys? Who are they? I mean, that's ridiculous.
Yes, it is ridiculous. And unfortunately, I heard the expression bad guys quite frequently in discussions of this. You know, it's an example of tactical military thinking. You want to know who you are authorized to fight against and to kill, but that is irrelevant to strategic thinking about how to achieve a political objective. But I'm afraid, you know, I found a lot of this type of simplistic thinking in the U.S. government.
What about the lie that's been revealed in these documents, that the Americans knew that Hamid Karzai had pretty much stolen an election, that he had manipulated the vote to make sure he was the winner, but they realized they just couldn't say anything?
I don't entirely agree with that interpretation, because it implies that somehow there is a fair result that we knew about that didn't take place. The fact is that in a country with no birth certificates, where many people do not have legal names, they do not have addresses, where there has never been a census, it simply is not possible to hold a fair election based on individual voters, because no one knows who are the individuals in the country. So while the election certainly was not fair, it is not true that there was a fair election that could have been carried out. The whole flaw was the idea that you could impose a democratic system on a country that did not have the institutional infrastructure to implement it.
Here's a quote about corruption, which many people interviewed said was really because of all of the foreign aid coming into the country, a lot of it American money, and in the Afghan culture, that money was being appropriated by people who had no business taking control of the funds. This person says, I like to use a cancer analogy. And this person talks about petty corruption, about endemic corruption, but then about kleptocracy, where governments steal money. And he says kleptocracy is like brain cancer. In other words, it's fatal. Did the Americans know what was going on and just keep pumping money into Afghanistan?
Well, the person who said that is someone I respect, Jeff Eggers, who worked for the National Security Council, and I work with him. But I would put it a little differently. The problem was not that Afghans stole the money and the Americans were honest. The problem was that the basic reason for the conflict was counterterrorism. We pursued that counterterrorism conflict by supporting and organizing militias, not just by supporting the official security forces of Afghanistan, but by supporting unofficial militias, by carrying out our own unilateral military activities, all of which is not in accord with the law of Afghanistan. So, of course, when you carry out covert operations, they're not in accord with the law of the country where you're carrying them out. You're carrying them out for your national interest, not only in Afghanistan. So that when we started to investigate corruption, we inevitably came upon people who were being paid by the CIA. So the focus on the misappropriation of aid money is misplaced. The whole basis of the operation was not aid money. It was military money and covert operational funds that were used to accomplish America's counterterrorism objectives. And those were not bound by the so-called goals of the operation of building democracy, human rights, and so on, as exemplified by the fact that the peak of this system was Guantanamo itself, an offense to human rights.
Barnett, I cannot thank you enough. Thank you so much indeed for giving us that analysis here on the NewsHour. Barnett Rubin speaking to us from New York.